Well, welcome to our 16th and final installment of our study of the Gospel of Mark. Today, we are going to be basically covering the last moments of the crucifixion. Well, actually, most of the moments of the crucifixion, but really the epilogue of the Gospel, which carries us to the original ending, which is 16 verse 8. And then we will have a brief conversation at the end to talk about those additional verses that were added much later. But because of the just because of the way that they connect or really don't connect, we will really leave those aside for the time being for most of our conversation today. You know, usually when I talk about when I start talking at the beginning of a class, I have sort of specific things to say about the text we're about to study. But today, I felt more motivated to talk about just literature in general and the way that the ancient understanding of literature is so different than what the modern understanding of literature is. And I'll say it this way. In ancient literature, the power of the word was in the act of being able to speak the word itself. There was a force in the use of words. Think of it in the ways that even in ancient Israel, it was an act of power to scribe someone's name on a rock and throw it off a cliff. That wasn't just a symbolic act. That was believed to have power. And so the act of speaking, even in ancient Greece, and the power of words was so real to them. So think about why, how rhetoric was such an important part of ancient Greece. But so when they had texts, when they viewed text, when they had literature, it wasn't about the words so much, but the power that was held within them. And so it was about what the text could do, not what it meant. Now, in modern ideas or modern way of appreciating literature, it's sort of the opposite. We look at literature and language as being, well, these are just sort of codes to decipher, and we want to get to their underlying meaning. And that's a real modern conception, because the idea of meaning was not that important to the ancients. So it's a difference here of, is it about what the words can do, or is it about what they mean? And again, it's not that one is wrong and one is right, but we moderns really tend to over-focus on trying to determine meaning from the words, when the ancient texts were really more about what do these words do? What are the power that they can wield? What's the force that they can create to then initiate a response? Here's another cool thing. When you look at some of the ancient texts in their analysis of this, you look at things like Aristotle in his book, The Poetics, and others. There's this understanding that if you really want to generate a response from your audience, the way to do that, one of the most powerful ways to do that, is to take it's like a reversal of fortune. So you go from something good about to happen to then twisting it around to being something bad, and that tends to elicit more of a response. Okay, so setting up all these expectations and then having them fall apart is better than having no expectations at all in terms of a reaction that it creates in us. Okay, and that's what Mark does a lot of. This whole gospel has been a setup basically along those lines. Think about the disciples themselves. They were set up to have so much potential, so much opportunity. They were with Jesus. They were in front of his teachings, his miracles. They heard all the things he said. They were set up to get it. And then there's this colossal fall. And it's not colossal in the sense of, it wasn't this precipice. It was sort of like falling down steps, because the whole time after their initial positive reaction, they sort of were falling. Okay. And that creates a response in us. and it asks us, where we are in the story. And so Mark utilizes that kind of ancient approach to literature and to the use of language in the way he writes his whole gospel, but certainly the way he wraps it up. And so we've seen how all the disciples to this point have failed. They've deserted him. They've denied him. They've betrayed him, all of it. And yet in this episode, just after the crucifixion, we're introduced to another group, an unknown group previously, this group of women, these women from afar. It says, I'll read it, it says, women looking on from afar, who when he was in Galilee followed him and ministered to him. So we don't know, who are these people? And in fact, what's really interesting to note is that with the exception of Pilate and the centurion, this whole section from 1540 on is all new characters. It's all new characters. And it's sort of, it's Mark's way of maybe introducing the possibility of hope. Okay, this fresh soil that's yet been untilled, because we don't know how they're going to react. And so he's sort of introducing this new opportunity for hope as we are in these difficult days of crucifixion, and then the time before empty tomb and the time of empty tomb. So the question that's before us then, as we read through it, is how is that hope rewarded, okay, or not, as we see this chapter, as we see this gospel completed. In the notes, I've also included the outline of the rest of this stuff for those that have been using that all the way through. But that's sort of the setup I wanted to give this morning as we enter into this last session. And now I'll open it up to you and any of the questions or comments that you have related to today's material or to where we've gone thus far. Bonnie, and then Carol.
One of the things that struck me as I read this with a centurion, I think it was a centurion, in the New Testament, the way that it's worded, when Christ dies and when he finally dies, the soldier says, "So this is the Son of God, really?" And I'd always heard that as being emphatic, this is the Son of God. But the way that they put it here is like a question. It's like, he died. Do you really think he's the Son of God? I mean, I got a entire different take on it from reading
Yeah, well,
this
that certainly gives you a different take on it. And I'm not sure what was the translation you said you used there?
The New Testament, and I forget the exact where that is, the exact verse, but it was a question mark, like, this is the Son of God. Yeah. Oh yeah, here it is. This human being is God's son, really? So it was like, oh, that's totally different than how that's ever been.
And that's, to me, I'm not sure. Yeah, I know where the part you're referring to is. I don't know that the New Testament translation, I'm not sure is. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, but I think what they do in situations like this, there's the words of the Greek may leave room for, oh, is this a question or is this a statement? And I think through the context you can determine, and I would agree with I use the NRSV, the New Revised Standard. I would agree that it's more of an emphatic statement than a question, and that to put it as a question is not as it doesn't hold up. And to me, it's much more impactful, and it makes more sense that the centurion would finally recognize him on his death, when all of the other ones around him who it was always the so-called outsiders that sort of saw Jesus for who he really was. So it really, I think, is more impactful and consistent for it to be an emphatic statement. But yeah, I'm not sure where that, I look deeper and see if there's notes as to why they chose to make it a question, because I've mostly seen it as an emphatic statement in Mark. Carol, and then I see Kathleen.
I just had a question. This is the first time I've noticed Salome being mentioned as one of the women. Is Mark the only place where she is mentioned? Because when I saw the name Salome, of course, the only thing I could think of was the beheading of John the Baptist. So it just stuck out to me.
Yeah, I don't remember if it's the only gospel to mention her, but the fact that he gives them names is important and is supposed to have an impact for us. And I will have to look to see if there are I just don't know if the other gospels mention a Salome. I don't know that for Mark, it's as important, the specifics and like the history behind the names, as it is the fact that they're named. And it reminds us of others who were named in their following of Jesus and what happened to them. And this is sort of setting up, all right, so now what's going to happen to these ones, that sort of thing. But I'll have to look into that. Kathleen? Oh, okay. It got answered, or you just, okay. Barbara?
Well, this is just a footnote on Salome. In my Bible, there's a little footnote that says that probably the same woman who in Matthew 27:56 is called the mother of Zebedee's sons. So I don't know if that's truthful or not, but that's what.
Yeah, it could be. Again, I am not a big fan of the gospel kind of connections always, because I just see them as so much more often distinct, and that to combine things, while it might be, it can help us to make a more cohesive story between them. I don't know if we really need to do that. So it could be, but I think what we'll try to do today is look at what Mark's doing with these people and what our response as an audience is in this particular context, and we'll focus on that for today. But yeah, they could well be reflective of people from history, kind of like last week when we covered the names Alexander and Rufus. Remember that? And it was just like, well, we don't really know who they are. They're very common names. They're Greek names. So it's like, it could be people that the audience would have known, and that would have had more meaning to them than maybe even to us. Was there another? Oh, Marilyn? Unmute.
To what the centurion is reported to have said in the two different versions. And Dan, I think it really relates to what you were saying about the difference between trying to figure out the meaning of the words and a different kind of power that they have, because the power that comes from those two different versions is real different.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's sort of it's sort of like a choose your own adventure almost, and it just can open up two widely divergent paths of meaning there. When he says it as an affirmative statement, as a representative of the Roman state, or if he just continues to question, and that sort of thing. So,
and it's punctuation that really makes
exactly
a big difference here.
Yeah, it sure does. It sure does. And again, there's very little or no punctuation in these texts, so a lot of the figuring is contextual. Mm-hmm. Are we ready to read? Do we have some folks who would like to volunteer to read today? Our last opportunity. So if you haven't volunteered, this is it. Sorry, I'd like to. Yes, I see you, Sue. All right, Sue. Was that a scratching of your ear, Kathleen? Or okay. So say Sue, and who else? All right, Sue, it looks like you're doing the whole thing. You can thank everybody. No, okay, Carol and Jay. All right, let's start with 3. I think we can make it. It might be a little longer, but we got this. All right. Oops. There we go. Okay, so why don't we just start with verse 25, Sue, and read through the death of Jesus portion, okay? That part.
Okay.
Thank you.
It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up to him with him to Jerusalem.
Thank you. Carol, would you read starting this portion of the burial of Jesus?
When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid.
Thank you. Now, let me get to the next chapter. Where's my little arrow? Let's see here. There it is. All right, Jay, would you read just through verse 8 of this chapter 16, please?
When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb in terror and amazement and had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
You know, every time, thank you all. Every time I read these texts, something else grabs me. And this time, that verse 7 there in chapter 16, verse 7, where it just says, go tell his disciples, and it really specifies, and Peter. And, you know, I guess you could see that in a couple different ways. You know, some people might say, you know, to the disciples, and then that one that's even lower than the disciples, Peter. But I don't think it's that. I think it's more of a tender reminder, or a calling to him, that even after all of that, Peter is still included, you know, given another chance. It's just I don't know, there's something very poignant about that to me. It just grabbed me today. But that's the way it works. It is always so many details like this, so many things that jump out. Okay, so let's go through this material here. So we start off in Jesus on the cross, and really this is very much time stamps here. You know, you got 9 o'clock, noon, 3, 6, that sort of stuff. But why do you think Mark gives us that detail about the two criminals that are hanging on either side of him? What is the two bandits there at the beginning of our material today? What do you think that the point of that is? What does that call to mind, if anything? Bonnie?
I had never noticed that before, that they both taunted him, because you always hear about the one thief that, you know, says, you know, surely this man is the Son of God, and Christ says, you know, you'll be with me in paradise. And that's not even mentioned. Mark doesn't even mention that. But he mentions that they both taunted him. And I thought, well, I always thought that guy was the guy that was sort of, you know, listening to him and, you know, hanging on whatever he said and had this, you know, enlightenment. But he was making fun of him too, until apparently in one of the other gospels, he changed his viewpoint. But I don't know. So that's why it impacted me, because I just never had noticed that. I don't think we ever hear about that.
Well, thank you for bringing this up. And I mean, it's just, this is what happens so often in our analysis and in our reading of these stories. It is so hard not to compare, you know, the way certain characters or themes are utilized by one writer versus another. But Mark's way of using those bandits is just different than Luke or Matthew. And, you know, a lot of scholars contend that Matthew and Luke were written as a form of corrective. I mean, Luke even says it himself at the beginning of the gospel. He's like, you've heard all sorts of other accounts, but this one is the orderly, a true one, you know. And the fact is, the reason why the church centuries later added all those verses to the end of Mark is because they didn't think it was a satisfactory ending. Now, I think they just didn't get it. I think they missed it. But I think that the other gospel writers do spend time trying to do their own correctives to certain things. So they'll add in certain details to tell the story that they want, and that's fine. But it's to say that it's not like one cohesive path here. There's the way Mark uses certain characters in situations, and then there's the way the others do, or don't. Some of them don't even mention it. We know very famously that Mark had no interest in a birth story. Okay, does it mean that Jesus wasn't born? Of course not. But each one tells their own story. And so to me, you know, as a minister and as a storyteller, as a deep diver into humanity, I find it to be just more impactful and meaningful and even important to try to allow it to stand for itself. So in Mark's telling, you're right. There's these two bandits on either side who are not that sort of like, you know, relatable, romanticized vision that some of the others, but you know, that sort of are repentant. No, they're taunting him too. That's quite a different picture. But anything else about the fact that there's one on either side of him? Does it call to mind any other things that we've looked at or heard in the gospel so far?
Kind of a reverse of the transfiguration.
It's not only a reverse of the transfiguration, but it's a sort of a truthful rendering of that time remember when it was, I think it was James and John, or I forget which two, but they remember, and Jesus is like, what are you guys talking about? And they ask him, hey, which side of you can we sit on? We want to sit on the right side and the left side. You know, that whole thing, when all they were aware of was their own glorification and they were just missing the whole point. Well, this picture shows what it really means to be with Jesus on his right and on his left. That's what's called for. That's what's asked for, to take up your cross and to be with him in all of it, not just in the glory, but in the pain and the suffering and the struggle. And that's something that we saw that the disciples, they thought they could do, but they never could drink of that cup. But that is the cup that Mark is showing us. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. And when you read the all the sort of the derision and the mocking that happens, whether it's the two on the cross, the bandits, or all the others, all of this, it's like 6 verses or 5 verses that just goes into all of this mocking. As you read it today, even, what was your reaction to it? Did you have a reaction to it? Did you see or hear something this time that, you know, what do you think the point of all that mocking is? How are we supposed to react to it? What does it make us do as an audience? Go ahead, Bonnie. Yeah, I see your hand.
I'm always talking, so I think I talk too much. It makes me think about Peter, who said, well, I would never do that. You know, I wouldn't be mocking him. If I was there, you know, I would be with his mother down at the bottom of the cross or something, you know, very reverent and weeping and sorrowful. But I would never mock him. And that's just what it reminded me of, was Peter's reaction.
Yeah, it definitely does recall some of the things that Peter said and others have said. You know, we talked about last week the powerful verbal irony of Peter in his denials, and how when he kept saying, I don't even know Jesus, I don't know the man. And the point was, he's right. He didn't know the man. He was saying exactly what was true, even though he was doing it to save his own skin. So how then do the mocking maybe pick up on some of that verbal irony, or other comments too? Because I saw Horty and then Dan. Did you want to say something, Horty? Or?
Last week I was recalling that Jesus said, I will not drink again of the vine until I drink with the Father in heaven. And in this particular one, it doesn't say that he did not drink it, but they put up the soured wine to him. And that just struck me that, no, he said I wouldn't. And once again, he's not doing what he's
yeah.
Do.
Well, it's interesting because there's 2 instances of lifting wine or offering him wine. The first one he refuses, and then this second one where he's in his, you know, on the cross and sort of exclaiming, crying out, that someone lifts it to him right then. And it doesn't clearly indicate whether or not he partook of it. But that to me is it's a very powerful act at that stage, you know, an act of, well, I don't know. It could be either way, couldn't it? It could be an act of mocking, but it could be an act of just some type of anonymous compassion. It's hard to say. Dan, you want to say?
But it is soured wine.
Right.
It does say it's soured wine.
Yes. Yes. Dan, did you want to say something? And then Mark?
Regarding the mocking, I understand why the scribes and the Romans would be mocking him, but I was surprised when it said the people were mocking him. I would have assumed that the people were with Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a good point. And again, we don't know which people, but we do know what the effect of all this mocking is, and that's what we're going to talk about. What the effect of it is. Margaret, did you want to add something too?
I think the bandits were afraid. They feared that Jesus had something that they didn't have. He had faith, and they didn't understand that.
Well, I think you're dead on that what they were saying there, both the bandits and then everyone else who was mocking, there was a total lack of understanding of who Jesus was. And we have seen throughout the gospel that a lot of those who speak in such ways do speak out of places of fear, or just simply just not being able to see. You know, they think they see, but they don't, because really it's not about seeing, it's about hearing. It's about really embodying what Jesus is telling them. So all of these people who are mocking represent that class of people who just don't get it, But as we see, and you know, Dan pointed it out, it seems to suggest that everyone is mocking him. Everyone, to his left, to his right, in front of him. They've deserted him. There's no disciples. There's no friends. There's no family. The people, they're all What's the effect? Where does this leave Jesus at this point? Barbara.
He's in the dark night of the soul.
Absolutely. He is completely and utterly alone. That's sort of all that mocking is designed to say there is now no one left. There's no one left. He is completely alone on the cross. Okay. And so then that irony of all the mocking is that in much the same way as we talked about Peter, the irony is everything they're saying is really something that we already know what's true of Jesus. And so really their mocking is falling on their own heads. Okay, when they're sharing that stuff, that's about them. It has nothing to do with Jesus, because we as an audience, we know where Jesus has come from. We know that all those mocking, derision comments, derisive comments are not accurate. So we know so it makes us react to that and be like, no, your derision's on your heads, buddy. That has nothing to do with Jesus. Okay, so it aligns us further with Jesus. Okay. Now I want to say something. Oh, go ahead, Boyce, and then Marilyn.
I was just going to say that it seems like here's this person in such, I just can't imagine the pain that would be, being nailed to a cross and up there. And in such pain and such agony, and rather than just, okay, he's in agony, they mock him, which makes it even worse. And it seems like it draws you closer to Jesus, that you feel for him, and that it doesn't, the mocking doesn't make you dislike him. It makes you like him even more.
That's right. That's exactly what Mark is intending it to do. It aligns the audience much more with Jesus than it does with those mocking him. And in fact, it creates a further distance. It's like, oh, you guys, you just don't get it. You're wrong. All that stuff. It creates that sort of reaction in us. But I'm going to come back to the question of suffering with Jesus and the agony that you're describing, because Mark's very specific in what he focuses on here. And I want to come back to that. But you're keying in on something that I think is very important related to the type of suffering that Jesus is going through. But before we go there, I want to, Marilyn and then Kathleen.
It's only been, wait a minute.
You're on.
I'm on, okay. It's only been recently that I have developed a real different understanding about Jesus and have seen him as so courageous. Because he never really did anything other than praying to God to take this away from him, but he didn't try to defend himself. It almost seems like he might have been able to persuade Pilate not to
Yeah.
to have him crucified if he had just spoken up. But he was very bravely doing what he needed to do in order to become a sacrifice, or I don't know quite what I want to say, but in order for it to play out the way he believed it needed to.
Yeah.
And I think until quite recently, I got kind of taken in by the taunting, and of course felt sympathy and sorrow for what he was going through, but it got in the way of my seeing his real courage.
Yeah.
And that has meant so much to me to have that new understanding.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that is an important part for Mark, that Jesus is, there are some heroic elements to him in the way he walks through this. And part of why he's walking through it is because it's what had to happen in his understanding. You know, at the time where he's in front of Pilate, he's already said everything that needs to be said. So that's why he's not speaking because he's just too meek. He's just like, you know, it's sort of like we all hit that point, you know, when you're having certain conversations with people, there's a point where you've already said everything that you can say. And so there's no point in saying it again, because people will do what they will do. And that's the sense that's happening in Mark. And so that's what I mean when I say it's sort of a fulfillment here. Again, it wasn't because God said, you know, this had to happen, but it's more about just because people are what they are. And the soil types that we have seen, 3 out of the 4 are not going to be fruitful. Okay. 3 out of 4. So it's just the way people tend to be. And so there was really no reason for Jesus to kind of like say anything else at that point, because the nature of those around him at that stage was that they were intent on taking his life. And so he was intent on not allowing them to take his life. He was intent on giving his life. You see the difference? Yeah. And so there's that courage. That is absolutely courage, you know, and that's the whole, you know, part. Anyway, there's a whole rabbit hole and there's a whole nother direction to go in that, but that is very true. Mark definitely wants us to understand Jesus as courageous and showing us, his original audience certainly, but any of us, to how to go through these things well, you know, as you face counsels, as you are derided, as you are mocked, as you are beaten, as you are killed, that sort of thing. Was there one other hand? Oh, Kathleen, I saw your hand. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that the way Mark tells this story, and you had asked about the chronology, I think it draws the reader in so much that it makes me feel as if I were there. And this is how I would have told the story, you know, at this time and then 3 o'clock. But it makes me see it a little differently, because I can sort of feel like I was one of those people right there. And then I'm thinking about the crowd, and we all know about mob psychology. And we saw that recently in our own nation, that, you know, people that might not have done things, but when there's a big mob, and, you know, that I don't know how big that mob was in front of Jesus either. I'm calling them a mob. But I think Mark does a really effective job of bringing me into the tale of this crucifixion and Jesus's last hours.
Amen. Because if you didn't feel that way, then he's failed. But he hasn't failed, because I think we are all gripped. Think of this as being meant around a campfire, this story, the whole thing though. So an hour and a half presentation, you know, and telling the story the way he does. We are right there. We're over the shoulder of all the different characters that are happening. That's how we are meant to feel, okay? We are witnesses to every single thing that's happened. Mark brings us in as sort of an active audience, and it's really all intentional because it's leading to a very specific place. So I think it's very keen to recognize the way he has pulled us in, because that's what he's tried to do. He's wanted to do that. And I think the way he tells it with the voicings he does, and with the energy and this happened and this happened and this happened. We are on a journey. We are with him, the whole time. There's no like sitting back and developing this and waxing poetic and describing this. No. We're in it with him, and with all of them. And so that's critical to where Mark's taking us. Dan.
Regarding the mocking, I think that Mark has set up a paradox here. The scribes and the crowd are all mocking him because of the king of the Jews. And yet, and they don't mock him about his beliefs and his teaching. And yet Jesus didn't claim to be the king. He was all about his teaching. So it's I don't know, I call it a paradox. And I think that also sets up part of the conflict in our minds to where we get with Jesus there.
Well, yes. I mean, here's the thing. It's a lot of verbal irony. So calling him the king of the Jews and deriding him for that, we know that he's much more than the king of the Jews. So he is and he isn't the king of the Jews. And the fact that that's what they crucify him based on is really irrelevant. And they do make comments on his sort of power, maybe not his teachings, but the fact that they keep saying, so if you were really this powerful, you could step down off that cross. You'll have to come off the cross, see how powerful you are. You saved all these others, you can't save yourself. That sort of idea. But we as an audience already know that that's not how Jesus' power works. It never is to show off power so that people will believe. No, it takes people who have open hearts, good soil, and can see him for who he is, who bring their faith to him. That initiates the co-power. It's never about Jesus having the power and imparting it for the sake of showing off or proving anything. It's never how it worked. And it doesn't work that way. But the fact that they're deriding him, expecting that, is another indication that they themselves are bad soil or not fruitful soil. And they just don't see it. They don't understand. Okay. They don't know what his power is really all about. They're still operating from the power view of the Caesars and the military and the power over and, showing off, that kind of stuff. That's not the kind of power that Jesus ever wielded. He was a power with, he was never a power over. So it's more indication, but you're right. It helps us then ask the question, how do we relate to this one who's hanging on the cross? How are we impacted by what's happening to him and then by what he taught? Because we see them continually to bash him physically, emotionally, intellectually, all of it, to tear him down based on things that we know are not true. Once again, Mark has brought us so into this that we're further identified with Jesus. We're sort of like, no, not them. You guys are just so off base. But it leaves us with, okay, so where am I? Okay, that's going to reach some resolution here pretty soon because we only have a handful of verses left. Was there another hand up? I didn't. Porty?
The whole taunting thing reminded me of Jesus's temptation by the devil. You can make bread, you can fly off this mountain, and I'll give you all the power. The specificity of come down or call Elijah, or the specificity of that reminded me of those temptations.
Yeah, some of which is from other gospels, the specific aspects of that. But there is a connection to the whole down. Okay, the word down is mentioned many times in this whole cross scene. And so there's a play on words with the word down. Okay, so we will get to that. But I want to first get to the words that Jesus says, those famous words, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I want to know how those words are both tragic and hopeful. Carol?
I thought that it again was misunderstanding. They think he's saying Elijah. And that's why they expect Elijah to come, because again, they misunderstood him.
Right. They absolutely do, and you're absolutely right. But if then what he does say is, my God, why have you forsaken me? How are those words themselves, like what he actually said, how might those be both tragic and hopeful? And tragic, not, just the pathos of it, the pathos, whatever. How might it be sort of engendering that sort of emotional, sadness, that tragic response, but also an act of hope? Boyce, and then Horty.
Well, it brings to me, it just sounds like he's given up. That he doesn't think that God is doing what he hoped God had done or was supposed to do. And so he's just saying, hey, you've left me. What's going on here?
Right. And many scholars have picked up on that, what you said. And if you take it as just a line that represents only itself, it does. It sort of represents this really human response. He's been abandoned by everyone. All the mocking tells us that he's been abandoned by all his earthly friends. And now this line says he even feels abandoned by God. But within that, what's hopeful about a prayer to God about how abandoned you feel by God? What's hopeful about that? Horty?
Well, what I heard was he was still saying, my God, he's still my God.
That's it.
And then the other part that came up for me was why? Not you did this, but why? I don't understand it.
Yeah.
It's beyond my understanding in this particular moment, but that he's still calling on God as my God.
It's still a prayer to God. To the God whom he feels abandoned by, he's still praying. So it's recognizing that there's still within this tragedy, within this sense of abandonment, he's still praying to God. So there's that. But then there's something too that many scholars have commented on, and for some reason this is such a source of debate, but I tend to find it compelling. And that is the line, my God, why have you forsaken me, is verse 1 of Psalm 22. We talked about last week how when they divide the clothes before or just when he's put on the cross, that's also from Psalm 22, verse 18. And if you read the entirety of Psalm 22, it is a psalm that starts off with a tremendous amount of suffering. It is dark, it's painful, it's tragic, but then it moves and finishes at a place of hope. And so my feeling is this may be Mark's way of putting that psalm on Jesus' lips with the intention of not just focusing on that first line, but to bring the whole psalm to mind. That all of it is real, all of it is there, but it's not just the suffering that's being focused on here. I find that to be impactful, and I find personally, I still find myself compelled by that. Many scholars don't. They still think, well, I don't necessarily know that it refers to Psalm 22. But to me, it just sort of follows that way of expressing that this isn't just about masochism. This isn't just about, you got to suck it up and deal with the suffering and then die and then, good luck. It wasn't that. It seems to be that there's something more suggested here that's possible. Again, I'm not saying that that's definitely how it is, but I think the fact that Mark refers to other themes from Psalm 22, it suggests that he may be trying to call that whole thing to mind. Any questions or comments about that? Jay?
Definitions that I've seen before make reference to the fact that at that point, Jesus is taking on the sins of all humanity, and that's when a disconnect occurs between he and God.
Well, that's a very theological understanding that certainly the church, that way of saying that he died to take on the sins of the world, that's, to me, that gets to be a little bit further down the road reflection on this. I'm not sure that that's what Mark is saying. I do think you're right in saying that he feels a sense of complete aloneness here. but Mark doesn't really give us what that sort of theological analysis. So I'm hesitant to really go to that place. We know that what motivated Jesus to be on the cross was what we've talked about. The fact that he was sent not to die, he was sent because it was a foolish hope on the part of the one who sent him, as that parable of the tenants tells us. And so when he has to die, it's because of the wiles and the evils of those around him. And that there is a redemptive quality of him giving himself for them. But I don't know, it just gets into that church gray area as we go further, basically. Horty and then Bonnie.
And this study and our conversations about it, and certainly I'd say the enlightenment that you have brought, at least to me, has really helped clarify that part that has never made any sense to me, which is really that theological.
Yeah.
Atonement,
the atonement theology, that the way that we've talked about it, that leads us to think,
that it was a punishment.
That's the whole point of the story. And I think we'll see some of that in the addendum to this gospel. We'll see some of that, and we'll get to that. But it's the way Mark has written it, it's just not focusing on that. He's much more urgent and real in what he's trying to say and get us to do because of this gospel. And that's what I want to focus on today.
And at least
some of the other reflections are later.
He never claims that theological viewpoint.
Exactly. And that comes from other gospels and other reflections, and then these combinations.
Yeah. And it's never made any inner sense to me. And so it's been really nice to, I don't want to say be vindicated, but to say, yeah, it's okay to not get that, because it doesn't have to be gotten. I don't have to get that theological viewpoint for my faith to matter. It really doesn't. And I've often thought, well, that argument is something I really don't care about. It doesn't affect me, or it doesn't feel like it affects me. What we've talked about in this study has really affected me deeply and daily.
Right. And I think that's where Mark's coming from too. Mark's talking about something that will engender a response within our hearts and within our lives. Sometimes when we talk about things that have to do with theology and belief, it's more about what we're going to assert and sort of agree to, like a creed or something. And it just becomes a little, it just moves it to a different place. And so I'm just trying my best to keep us focused, as best we can, because it's not always easy, but on where Mark was really taking us with his particular way of telling the story. And it's not to dismiss the other reflections, but just to recognize that these are later reflections that have often been put on these stories, these theological reflections. There was one other person. Marilyn?
Yeah, Bonnie, you don't have to worry about talking too much, because I'm talking a lot, and then you aren't. So there's something I want to share that is relevant sort of to the bigger picture that we've been talking about all through Mark. And I'm so worried that we'll run out of time and I won't have a chance to share it, but I'm going to share it now. On television, and I can't really tell you too many of the details, but I heard about a performance that was a reading of Mark in one of the Broadway theaters. I mean, a big theater. And it was absolutely jam-packed. And it was just a reading of Mark. Dan, you've talked so about the fact that it's like a small play.
Yes.
And I was just fascinated by that, to hear about this on television right at the time that we're studying it.
I believe his name was David Rhodes. He was one of the first, and it was on Broadway. It was immensely popular. I believe it was in the early 70s, mid 70s, something like that. One of my good friends from Massachusetts was a performer of this gospel in the same vein. And when I went on sabbatical, that was one of my, I really wanted to focus on doing the very same thing, memorizing this gospel and then learning to perform it. I didn't do that, but I still have hopes, because to me, it's just such a perfect way to really communicate so much of what we've been talking about for these 16 sessions, but to really condense it, you know, with the way that the experience of hearing it in a dramatic form, using music and using, you know, singing parts of it, and just, you know, oh, you can do so much. But you're right, it communicates very powerfully. And for anyone that hasn't heard what Marilyn just mentioned, I believe his name's David Rhodes, but go and look it up on YouTube. You'll find these, and you can watch them, and they're about an hour and a half long. Oh, Kathleen just did. Was it David Rhodes? Or one of them? I think he's the most famous. I can't, if you're talking, I can't hear you. Oh, okay, it was, okay. And then just before we go on, I think I saw your hand up, Bonnie.
Well, the thing that got me about this, my God, why have you forsaken me? It took me back to the garden where Christ prayed that if this cup could pass from him, and then he's on the cross, it clearly did not pass. And it made me think of, you know, a father-son relationship. And if God is Christ's father, who of us as a parent would not take this away from our child? So our child would not suffer like this. No one wants that.
Right.
And so I can sort of see, like, he would feel abandoned because, you know, he prayed to his father. He asked his father, you know, don't let me go through all this suffering. And his father let him go through it when he really had the power not to. And so it made it, from a human standpoint, say, you know, why would you do that? Why would you let me suffer like this?
Well,
Anyway.
that's actually, to me, that's taking it a little bit further than what is maybe being said here. To feel abandoned does not necessarily say the same thing as feeling that someone either allowed it to be, or who caused it, or that sort of thing. But if he is singing here, like if this is a psalm and he's singing at this stage, you know, because this is what he's come to, then to say that's how he feels is very real, but it's not the end of where he feels either. If he's singing that psalm, go ahead and at some point read Psalm 22, and you'll see sort of the movement of that psalm, and it may suggest something a little bit different ultimately. And Mark, again, might be using it as a reference here to say that brings that whole psalm to mind. And again, I think that because he mentions other aspects of that psalm, when you read it, you'll see some other parts of it that are part of Mark's story. It may well be that that's what he's trying to do. But at this point, you're absolutely right in saying this is Jesus at this point is his most alone. Okay, there is nobody that he senses is supporting him right now. Okay, not humans, not God. And he's saying this line. And it brings us to something that's very important, because all of us have seen movies about the Passion, whether it's Mel Gibson's, which to me is the most impactful. And I don't mean that as I'm not saying it's the best. It had its moments. I actually I didn't hate the movie, but I just thought it was over the top. But we've seen these renderings, right, of what the Passion was. And so when we see Jesus on the cross, we react from that place most often. That's most often how we react. But I want to ask you, in terms of how Mark is talking about it, what is the nature of Jesus' suffering? What is his suffering? What causes his suffering here? Barbara, and then Horty.
Well, it is the bad soil, for one thing. But I'm going back to those words, and I'm thinking, my God is his prayer. Why have you forsaken me? He's saying that to everyone, including perhaps God. And then he immediately dies when they offer him the wine. He doesn't hang around down, farther on down, Pilate says, "You mean he's died already?"
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
And he didn't think he'd die so soon. But I think Jesus just gave up at that point and went to God.
Well, I don't know about that because Mark doesn't tell us gave up, but you're noting things that Mark has given us that are really important clues. So again, if what Barbara said is true, and that's what he has given us, is the nature of Jesus' suffering mostly physical? Is that what Mark is emphasizing here? The answer is no. There is no detail. There's hardly any detail about his physical pain. Okay, it's not that I'm de-emphasizing. It's not that it was there, but Mark is not talking about that as the primary source of Jesus' suffering. There's very little detail about the way he was beaten. There's very little discussion about the feeling of the nails as it goes through his. No, none of that. 6 hours is not a long time to have to suffer. Now, I'm not belittling the suffering. It's real, but it's not where Mark's focus is. The suffering on which Mark is focused is much more on the abandonment, the feeling alone, utterly alone. That is by far where Mark is spending his time talking. Throughout the whole crucifixion, that's where the focus is. The abandonment, the aloneness, okay? That's a totally different, the alienation that he's facing, okay? That's a totally different, a type of suffering than the physical. Again, I'm not saying the physical happened, but it's just not where Mark's paying attention. He's not talking about it. And the way he describes the physical stuff, yeah, it's there, but it's not it's certainly, there's none of what we saw in Mel Gibson's rendering in Mark. I mean, how long did that beating scene go on in Passion of the Christ? It's not what's emphasized here, but it's what we react to. We get very visceral about that. But Mark's focus is much more on that whole alienation, that aloneness part, and he's asking us to react to that as an audience. So in this sense, it's telling us about Jesus' crucifixion, but not necessarily because it wants to give all the details about Jesus' crucifixion. He's telling us all this stuff because he knows we're going to react to it. So when we see Jesus left by all his friends and no one's around, even God's around him, who's the one that's left? Us. The audience. You see what he's doing? Powerful. We'll keep going. He dies. And then that famous image of the temple curtain ripping, okay? What do you think? What's the symbolism of that temple curtain ripping? This is the first time Mark's mentioned a curtain in the temple. What do you think that means?
Well, when people rent their item, when they are mourning, they tear their clothes because they're in mourning, they rent the fabric.
Okay, yeah, so it could have to do with the sense of just when you're in a place of just grief and mourning, it's that tearing. What else?
I think
Peter?
it was symbolic.
Yes, because that's somewhat symbolic meaning here. Peter, and then I saw someone else. I think Barbara.
I think only the high priest was entitled to go through the curtain prior to this. And so tearing the curtain opened it to everyone.
Yes. It's a symbolic way of saying that through his death, Jesus, or when Jesus died, the boundary between humanity and the divine, which was previously sort of held to a select few, Jesus came to basically abolish that and by tearing the curtain, it's a symbolic way of saying, and now that is no longer a barrier. Okay, so that's certainly one of what Mark is trying to portray here. Here's something that's interesting. The Greek word that we translate curtain actually means something spread out down. That's what it literally means. Something spread out down. Okay. We've talked about how the word down is mentioned many times. You know, come down off that cross. If you want to prove that you're the Messiah, the King of the Jews, all that stuff, then come down off that cross. See, you can't save yourself. You know, pray for God to come down, that sort of stuff. And we know that's none of that is how it works. Again, Jesus never proves his power for the sake of instilling belief. It's always the opposite way. Here's something interesting too, though, about the whole tearing, the tearing of the curtain. The word tearing, there's only one other time where it's written in this gospel. Can you think of when? Carol?
Was it the naked man that tore his loincloth to run away?
No, he just dropped it. Somebody had to think of that guy to call that guy to mind again, though. So thank you, Carol. Boyce?
I was saying that they tore Jesus' clothes off.
Oh, yeah, but it's a different rendering there.
Oh.
It's another rendering. It's after he was baptized and the heavens tore open and the Holy Spirit descended. That scene is a similar thing. And there's just this, once again, kind of like what Peter was saying, this way that the tearing of the temple curtain is a way of connecting. Now it's no longer just about Jesus and God. It's no longer just about the religious people and God, but it's about God and all, this connection. So that tearing of the curtain, while on one level is a reflection of grief and sadness, but also it's a reflection of liberation and freedom, that now we are connected in ways that are different. Okay, so there's something that Mark's saying there that's just really poignant. Okay, that opened it through that loving act of giving his life. Okay, Boyce?
I just, what came to my mind when you asked about the tearing of the curtain was Jesus was upset to me because the people didn't get it. So many of them just didn't get it. And so they were leaving him alone, but also the tearing of the curtain could be dividing the division that has come between the people and God. And so that oneness has been torn apart.
Well, I think what I thought, it's tough. What I was hearing you start to say there, and maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's like throughout the gospel,
better words than I could put in them.
Well, Jesus confronted the religious authorities, the ones that had all the power and wanted to be the sort of gatekeepers of who got in and who got all this, access to God. Throughout the whole gospel, Jesus is confronting them and basically saying, no, you're missing the point. And that famous line, no, the Sabbath, the law was made, and the Sabbath was made for humanity, not the other way around. And so rending the curtain is a way of removing that sense of barrier, that sense that any human has, that, well, I'm the one that can tell you the way to heaven, all that stuff. Jesus came to abolish that way of being and to connect humanity to God sort of directly, which is so curious to me then that what we did is we created a religion that basically reinstituted the curtain. We sewed that curtain right back up, didn't we? We did.
Yep.
We did.
And still,
I wonder what Jesus would say about all of this. but yeah, so to tear it open is to just sort of to break it open. Okay. And it's not that I don't look at the tearing of the curtain as a way of saying, now you've broken the connection between God and humanity. No, I think it's more about that you've opened it, because sacrificial love does that. It opens, it liberates, it frees, it creates connection. real connection. It doesn't seek to divide. It doesn't seek to wield power over. It doesn't seek to its own glory. You know, all those other characteristics that we saw. This now, it says, now we're all, it's open to all of us, okay? It's not just about the Jews either. It's about all people. So there's a big statement in the tearing of the temple curtain. There's a big statement there. But then after that, as soon as that happens, this is where we finally get introduced to those women, right? All of a sudden, we're introduced to this group of women in verses 40 and 41 in chapter 15. And we're like, okay, well, who are these people? And it's apparent that they were with him. That's what the scripture says. The text says it's like, okay, they were followers. They're disciples. They were there all along. They ministered to him. They listened to him. They were there. So we're like, oh, okay, these are new characters. Mark's giving us hope. Wait, how will these characters be? Well, maybe there's still a chance. This is what he's trying to do, okay? So his initial evaluation of them, Mark's initial presentation of them is very positive, very positive. But then, and in fact, I want to say this, there's only two negative female characters in the entire gospel. 2. Can you name them? Barbara?
I'll give you one, Herod's wife.
Yeah, Herodias and her daughter.
And her daughter.
Yeah. So those are only 2 women who are presented, who are given, and the only 2 women characters in the entire gospel who are seen as negative. So the fact that these are female characters, we're like, oh, well, okay, let's see where this is going to go. And then Mark names them. And what does that do? As soon as he's named them, what is your reaction to that, if anything? Is that a sign of, does that portend good things when you name disciples, or have we seen something else? Well, the other named disciples, it didn't work out so well. So the fact that he names these disciples casts a bit of a shadow. And so we're like, oh, okay. All right. Well, let's see what they do though. Okay. So Mark's presenting them. Okay, here we go. Let's see what they do. But now, oh, okay, they're named. All right. We still don't really have much else to go on, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Okay, that's basically all I'm trying to get at. And then they go to the tomb. And what were they expecting to see at the tomb? Were they expecting an empty tomb? Mm-hmm. No. Okay. So they weren't expecting an empty tomb. So what does that sort of suggest about their soil? What kind of soil they are? You see how subtle that is? But where Mark's going with this? It's another way of saying, oh no, maybe they weren't, so darn it, maybe they weren't listening either. He's set up our hopes, and he's in a microcosm, in a nutshell, he's giving us in these women the same trajectory that the disciples had. Oh no, they're going expecting a body, but they heard already that he said he would rise after 3 days. But oh no. And then their final reaction confirms the kind of soil they are. What do? They flee in terror. They tell nobody. And then the gospel ends. Verse 8, done. Some sources say, amen. Amen. All right. Remembering what I said at the beginning, that Mark is a rhetorical piece, okay? So the intention of the gospel, and truly of any gospel, any of the 4 gospels, but let's focus on Mark. The intention of a gospel is what it does more than what it means or what it says, okay? What is it doing, Okay, how does ending the Gospel of Mark in 16:8 like that, what does that do to us? Or what does that make you want to do? Barbara?
Well, if you end it right like that, it doesn't have a lot of hope. And another thing I wanted to say is it seems like anytime people have names, they become rocky soil.
Yes, that's true. And that's exactly what he's indicated when he first named them. And so we're like, oh no. And then he fulfills it as they basically prove that they are not the good soil that we hoped they might be. Okay,
Does
again,
it mean-
a microcosm of the entire story of the disciples in just a few verses. A follow-up?
Does it mean that the power of a name means that there's something? If we have a name, we are all rocky soil? I
No,
guess so.
no, because Bartimaeus had a name. Many of them had a name. But when you're a disciple in Mark's gospel and you're named, that's not usually a good thing. But all I'm saying is it's part of the narrative setup for us in our expectation. And again, in microcosm, he's given us another group of disciples who are at least thinking, oh, these are ones who they haven't left. Okay, when we're introduced to them, they're still there. So unlike the other disciples, they haven't fled yet. Oh my gosh, that's why we're hopeful. Okay, as an audience, we see that, oh, who are these women? Oh, maybe there's hope yet. Okay, yes, that's what we're supposed to feel. Then he gives them a name and we're like, oh no. Last time we heard names given to disciples, oh no. And then, oh no, they expect to see a body when they go to the tomb, but they know if they really listen to him, they would have, oh no. And then they run away. Oh gosh, this is disaster. Oh. Okay, what are we supposed to do with the end of this? Bertie and then Bonnie.
It makes me think that the audience is supposed to go out and tell the story.
Yeah, exactly. And in a sense, Barbara, it is an incredibly hopeful ending. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Go ahead, Bonnie.
I was going to say, it makes me understand why they added on all these other verses later. Most of us know the story from other gospels. And so we know that more comes. We know Mary comes back and she thinks the angel's the gardener and all that part that he left out. It's kind of like Jesus Christ
Did he
Superstar.
leave it out?
Well, it's like Jesus Christ Superstar ends with the death of Christ and you want to say, but there's more. What about the resurrection? You left that out. And it's kind of like, I sort of feel the same way, like, well, tell the rest of the story. It didn't just end there. But if this is all you ever read and you didn't know that there was more, or you hadn't read the other gospels, the whole road to Emmaus and all that, how Christ comes back to the upper room and all of that, that's not here.
Right.
And so,
but wait a second. Did he leave it out?
Well, he had to know about it, right?
No.
I mean, he didn't.
No.
He didn't know
have to
about
know about it. No. Why did he have to know about it? Is Emmaus even really a place?
I don't
No
know.
historical record of any place called Emmaus. Just because the other gospels said something, does it mean they were right and he was wrong? Is he trying
Well, I
to
just
tell
felt
us?
like they were
is
more
he trying to
complete.
tell us history necessarily? See, this is where we get to. We need to let go of what any of the other gospels are saying about this. They're telling their own story for their own purposes, and oftentimes much later. But what Mark's doing here is something different and very impactful. And I'm also asserting very hopeful, but it's just different. He's very much looking at the now, okay? And he wants a response. This whole gospel has been written as a way to get us to respond. Because like Kathleen said, and I think like you've all felt, we are there. We are like over the shoulder of Jesus. Yeah, go get him, Jesus. Oh, how could you do that, you idiots? All the way we react. I don't know that that's you, but that's me. When I read these stories, a lot of times that's what's happening inside of me. I can't believe that. Or oh my gosh, I relate to that. All of it. Okay?
Yeah, I could relate. I
Yeah,
could relate that
But
I'd run in fear.
I would say that Mark told the story exactly as he meant to tell the story.
Oh, I'm sure he did.
Yeah, so
Why?
let's not say that he's leaving anything out, because I think he didn't leave anything out. He told it exactly the way he meant to tell it. And so evaluating it then on its own merits makes us say, okay, what Birdie said in a nutshell, the ending makes us say, wait a second. What now? Just like a classic cliffhanger, okay? By this time, oh, go ahead, Horty.
The ending without the extrapolation always makes me feel like it's up to me. It makes it really personal.
Yeah.
The ending at that point, the story, the ending has not been written. It's up to me to develop whatever kind of soil I am.
This is it, folks. Yes, this is it. This is what it comes to, okay? Ultimately, in a nutshell, we've just been given one more frustrating story of another group of disciples who we thought was going to have it, and no, they didn't. They failed again. And so ultimately, frustrated by all these desertions and failings that we've been seeing, we are forced to, we're kind of left wondering as an audience, is there anyone else left? I mean, all his friends have deserted him. All his friends have betrayed him. Is there anyone left? All the ones that witnessed the transfiguration, they're all gone. All the ones that saw him do those powerful miracles, that listened to his stories about his predictions, about what's going to happen, whether the death and the rising, the resurrection, all of those, is there no one left? All those ones that heard what he said in Gethsemane, oh my gosh, they've all gone. Is there anyone that stayed with him through all the trial and through the passion and through the crucifixion? Did anyone stay through the burial, through the empty tomb? Is there no one left? Yeah, there is someone left. It's you. So what kind of soil are you going to be? And will you go and tell? Ultimately, that's all that Mark cares about. He's not trying to start a church or a new religion. He's offering a gospel and a Jesus that's trying to show people how to live lives that are connected to one another and to God. And to get all that other nonsense out of the way in a world that's been falling apart, where they need to get back to something, to understand something that is real. And it's like Mark has just presented this whole story of breaking things down in a world that's all broken apart. And he's given us something that is so profound. And he leaves us with that wondering. Doesn't matter what anyone else has done in the story. It only matters where we go from here. Okay, that was dramatic, I know. Any comments or questions or thoughts as we're kind of getting close to the end here? Peter.
Well, I love it. And I'll tell you why. We talked about the downside of naming things. And I think we could even expand that here. That to name what happens after this limits the possibilities.
Yeah.
Yet, if we seek Jesus, he's left the tomb. Where is he?
That's it.
Let's find him.
That's
and
it.
let's find him together. So that this co-creation you mentioned, we can co-create together.
Yes.
Rather than, Jesus is a cosmic superhero. He will do it all.
Right.
All we need to do is pray to Jesus.
Right.
No, it's us coming to him together. We can do it.
Amen. So much more. That is so much more of what Mark's focused on. And then to make it other things, like those additional verses, kind of make it more churchy and established and religious and all that. And then it gets more to that point of where we rely on Jesus as that cosmic superhero. We find that our only role is to pray to him so that he'll help us and all that. Where Mark's focus has always been, it is us together. It's a soil seed connection. Okay. So it has to end this way, I think, because this is where it happens within each one of us. And it need not be defined, because our own lives, our own hero's journey is our own to co-create. And that to me is just so incredibly hopeful, even while it's like, whoa, it's a lot. It's a lot on us, but it's not all on us. It's that co-creation thing. But yeah, he tells them, I'm going ahead of you to Galilee. Come find me. They don't. Will we? There was another hand up. I saw one earlier. Any other comments? Horty.
I just wanted to thank you for citing Psalm 22. I looked it up, and in reading it, there's so many lines in there that are recited and so many exactitudes, and it really does leave exactly where we're talking about now with great amount of hope. So I really want to thank you for including that, because you had cited it once before, but I hadn't looked it up at the right at the time. But boy, it really fits into to read it right now.
I agree. I really find it. That's why I said I really find it compelling to really that Mark has that psalm in mind when Jesus says what he says on the cross. Now, it's not. I think there's a lot of richness in all of the types of conversations we've had about that particular line. But yeah, it fits very well in terms of the arc, the movement of Psalm 22, and the ending of Mark's gospel in particular. Any other comments about the gospel as concluded in verse 8? Because I do want to mention briefly about the other verses. Okay, so verses 9 to 20 were added. Now there's a longer ending and a really longer ending, or something like that. There's actually two different endings, both of which were added maybe a century and a half later, or just significantly later. It may not be established when it actually happened. But when you read it, and we won't go into it as I want to refer to it, but when you read it, what it is basically summaries of the ways that some of the other gospels, I think primarily Luke and Matthew, ended their gospels. And so what it suggests is, this is when the church has been sort of more established. So we're a church now. And so we have these authoritative gospels, and they say different things. So it's important for us as a church, as an institution, to make things a little bit more cohesive. We're always looking to do that. I don't know why. So many people in their approach to the Bible are like, no, this has to fit with this, and this must reflect this. And so just let them be different. I don't know what it is. I think that's part of humanity. It's like some people think this all has to be one tightly woven narrative. And if there's anything that's in, conflict, then throw it all out because it must be a lie. Whatever. I don't know anyone that's quite like that. But the point is, these texts at the end of Mark are like summaries of, the Emmaus story from Luke. And then actually that might be from John even, I think it's from Matthew though, the gathering in the upper room after the crucifixion and resurrection, when he comes to find them, in the Thomas story, there's that reference. So it's these sort of like vague references and little summaries that kind of bring Mark into greater alignment with the other gospels that the church has come to consider authoritative. And when you look at that, I just want you to notice, first of all, in the way we've talked about how Mark ends at 16:8, does it need closure? I mean, that's why the church added these, because they felt like it needed closure. Like some of us have said, it's like, it just ends like that. That's terrible. Is it though? Does it need closure to you? Maybe it does to some, and that's okay. But when I read it, I think it says exactly the story that Mark wants it to say when it ends at verse 8. But read the verses and just think about it, focusing on how we've traveled through the Gospel of Mark, and then add those other verses and just sort of see, does it change the message? And importantly, does the addition of those later verses change what we are called to do in response to all of this? That's big. Again, the reason we write a gospel is because it enjoins us to do something. It makes us want to respond. That's what a gospel does. It's not just supposed to be like, oh, now I have hope. I'm going to sit back in my chair and just kind of relax and enjoy my newfound camaraderie with Jesus. No, that's not what's described. Other comments as we prepare to wrap this up? Boyce and Bonnie.
Well, I just thought that Mark ended it that now it's your responsibility, our responsibility to go out and spread the word. Whereas that added on part, it kind of takes that away because the disciples now go out and spread the word.
Yes. And you've obviously looked at it. Others that have, that's what I ask you to reflect on. And again, these are in the notes. So if you want to later on download the notes, but just read that material and compare it to what is asked of you if it ends at verse 8 versus what changes. And that's one of the things. There's a deep emphasis then on these disciples that all of a sudden are just like the agents of Jesus. They all of a sudden get it. And you're like, okay. That wasn't at all what happened throughout the entirety of Mark's gospel, but okay. And look, I understand why the church did that, because it was confusing for some. But I think it only makes sense to do that if you're trying to create this overall arcing narrative, which is what we've all received. The stories of the Gospels tell the same story, just in that some of them miss some points. It's like, we all have different perspectives. I don't think that's right at all. I think they tell different stories for entirely different purposes. They rely on similar sources, but they use the stories much differently. And so it's so good and important, and I think enriching, to really allow the Gospels to tell their own story, their unique story. And what the church did there, or the effect of what they did, was to kind of make Mark a bit of a different story. Bonnie?
In some ways, it's almost a disadvantage that we know the other stories.
Agreed.
And, because we've gone to church and even if you hadn't, there's movies, there's all of this that we've all seen throughout our lives so that we know other versions. And I can remember that we used to have little Gospels of John that you'd hand out to people, and sometimes, and it was like, if you've never read the Bible, read this, read the Gospel of John. This is your starting point. Yes. And you wonder if a person's first reading or first knowledge of anything in the Bible was the Gospel of Mark, how they might look at it differently than once you know John, and once you know Luke, and once you know Matthew, and all this. It sort of, kind of clouds things in some ways, because well, what about this and what about that, and all the rest of it. So in some ways it's a disadvantage, I think, that we know all those other stories.
I agree. And yet if we then accept that, and then we do our best to sort of just see whatever text we're studying in its own uniqueness, I actually think that enhances our ability to walk with faith and compassion and action in the ways that each one intends, because it's okay to know, you know, sometimes it can be fruitful to know some of the connections and just appreciate the differences. But it's when we try to say, but wait a second, that's not how it happened, or that's not, or that's wrong, or that's when we get we fall into a bit of a pitfall there. And that is hard. And that is in the way you said it, it's a disadvantage to those that have been exposed to church for all these years, because the way we tell the story is not, I don't think it's really very often very consistent with the way Mark tells his story. Now, some have walked this walk, you know. Martin Luther King is one that have people have embodied this walk, this way of walking, okay? But it's just overall, the way Mark ends it is very much about us choosing our path, choosing our relationship, choosing the way we will nourish our soil and live our lives as being so paramount, you know, to the further shaping of the kingdom of God, that the presence of God is enacted through us, and it doesn't require a church or other religious types, you know. That's big, that's revolutionary. But, you know, the church, unfortunately, we've seen that the way it works, it started off as one type of movement, and then it became something else when you involve emperors and power and military and conquest and inquisition and all this stuff, you know. So it had a long time to shift, you know, but where it was when Mark was giving this gospel was just a much different place. And so I hope that we have been able to touch that place and sort of just appreciate it in some way, you know, even though we're 2,000 years removed. Just hanging with this class for 16 sessions makes you like the disciple, the good disciples that didn't flee, you know, that you stay with it. So congratulations. But there's something to that, you know, just to engage Bible study the way we are trying to, and to just to go to these places where we don't always get answers that settle things, you know, that we are unsettled in some of this, but that's part of the journey. That's the walk of faith. So I want to say thank you for this faith walk, because it's what it is. You know, this isn't just an academic exercise. To study like this, in community like this, with questions like this, with grappling like this, with humility like this, is a faith walk. This is ministry in action. And so I pray that this will continue, this spirit of engagement with story, with life, you know, in an individual and a broader level, that it'll continue to grow in you. I think that's what Mark would pray, you know, and that's my prayer too. So, yeah, thank you all for
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
such a part of it.
Thank you.
All right, I'll be in touch about what's to come. Okay, it'll be a week or two, but we'll see each other again.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.